property owners that aren't selling above 5.15 million. Why do you think it's a bad thing for people in the bracket beneath that don't qualify for that?
Well, I think it's going to be a very bad thing for people who need housing because you're discouraging new
Right.
housing. So what happens when you discourage supply?
Hmm.
You have increasing demand, but you discourage supply. Well, prices go up. So what does that mean? It means it's more unaffordable to people, which
Right.
means you have more homelessness. But it was very deceitful because if you read the fine print in the legislation, it didn't just apply to millionaires and billionaires who are selling mansions in the city of Los Angeles, but in fact, it applied to any real property
Hmm.
that was sold for more than $5
5
million.
million.
The tax comprised a 4% on the gross sales. So even if you lost money on the
That's a
sale
big
of the
one.
property, even if you lost money on it,
Yeah.
you still had to pay it on the gross. And many people who are in the real estate development business, if they could get a 12% profit on a sale of a property after
Hmm.
they've done all the work, taken all the risk, and hired people to build it and gotten loans, given personal guarantees and all that,
Right.
they'll do the deal. But suddenly you had a lot of these people that in the course of doing these developments were finding that they're not going to get the profit. The profit is going to the city and it's basically given to the unions.
It's getting worse. So why would a taxpayer trust the government to fix it now? I think LA Times had an article recently where they mentioned that there's basically $20 billion that is unaccounted for. And there's a
That's
report
crazy.
that came out. And I would be interested to see, is there any legislation that can be done towards the government for this misuse of funds?
6 or 8 years ago, they had Measure H, which was there to bring up $3.5 billion in tax revenue to fight homelessness in the matter of 10 years. And then about a year or two after that, they did Measure HHH, which was there to bring up 1.2 billion in tax revenue to prevent homelessness. And Chris and I were just talking earlier how this homelessness just continues, and we're just going to throw more money into a money pit. Three balls, two strikes, pressure is on. This is where we discuss real estate, property improvement, and business. Together, we'll strategize on how to win. Welcome to the Full Count. Hi, welcome back to the Full Count podcast. Today, we have a special guest who's a real estate developer, attorney, and overall entrepreneur. And Keith Fromm, welcome.
Thank you, Andrew. Nice to be here.
We understand that there's a lot of challenges going on with Measure ULA, but if you could first introduce yourself, would be awesome.
Well, as you mentioned, my name is Keith Fromm. I live in Los Angeles.
Mhm.
I've been an attorney for since Fred Flintstone was in my law class and Abe Lincoln. So it's been a while. I also went into real estate development after initially practicing real estate law.
Mhm.
And then what you find when you're in real estate development is, particularly if you're doing land subdivisions, is you start to butt heads with cities
Mm.
on your approval. So that led me to getting into litigation with cities.
Mhm.
And by some miraculous fluke, I started winning these cases against them. And that sort of started me off on a new career now, as well as the old ones,
Right.
of litigating against cities for violations of constitutional rights. So
Mm.
the first big case that I won on that was a Fifth Amendment case, a takings case, and then a few weeks later won another one in federal court on equal protection. During the pandemic, an old friend of mine who was also a litigation attorney was working on these cases called reverse validation cases, and at that time I'd never even heard of reverse validation case. I hadn't, but he'd won some big ones, and since it was the pandemic and I wasn't doing much, he asked me if I wanted to help him out on these reverse validation actions, and he together on these we were quite successful. So I learned that in a reverse validation action, if a governmental agency passes some kind of legislation, they can either seek to have the courts validate it within a 60-day period, or if one is opposing the validity of such legislation, you can do what's called a reverse validation, in which case you challenge it. But you have a 60-day statute of limitations. So it's very,
Right.
very, very quick.
Mm-hmm.
Most attorneys aren't even aware of what these reverse validation actions are because they never see them in the course of their career. So a lot of these pieces of legislation go unchallenged simply because nobody's really been prepared to challenge them.
Mm-hmm.
When the ULA came in, and it was passed in on November 22nd of 2022. No, sorry, November 8th of 2022. The 60-day statute of limitations ran out basically at the beginning of
I
January.
see. Mm-hmm.
And so I said to my co-counsel, I said, we should really try to jump in on this, um, because I don't know who else is going to be doing it. Maybe nobody's going to be doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And if we did, and we got a client in the real estate community, uh, it was our hope that the real estate community would jump in and support us
Right.
because the consequences to them collectively were billions of dollars over an infinite period of time, for this tax.
Mm-hmm.
So on January 6th, we launched two lawsuits challenging the constitutionality of the ULA initiative and tax, 2023, one in federal court and one in state court.
Right.
And that's, uh, as it turns out, one other entity um, also launched a reverse validation action, and that was the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association.
Mm.
And they restricted their action to simply one cause of action. And it was one state cause of action.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and whereas ours was kind of a shotgun approach, and we had 17 different causes of action in each of these
Right.
complaints that we filed, including many violations of the U.S. Constitution, which
Mm-hmm.
was the basis for filing in the U.S. federal court. So that's where we stood on those lawsuits.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what the tax was, I don't know if your audience is even aware of what
Yeah,
this
if you can explain
U.S.
what Measure ULA consists of.
Yeah, well, it was a voters initiative in the city of Los
Mm-hmm.
Angeles. It only applies to properties in the city of Los Angeles, but it was sold as a mansion tax, and the
Right.
idea was that only millionaires and billionaires who don't pay their fair share
Right.
will have to pay this tax, and they will pay to solve the homelessness problem, and all the voters won't have to pay anything. So
Mm-hmm.
they'll get the voters will get a free ride if they vote to have people supposedly who own mansions that were selling for more than $5 million in the
Sounds
city of Los
good.
Angeles.
The way you
Yeah, so
say it.
yeah,
I
it was
guess.
classic class warfare,
Right.
tyranny of the minority, the majority versus the minority.
Right.
But it was very deceitful because if you read the fine print in the legislation, it didn't just apply to millionaires and billionaires who are selling mansions in the city of Los Angeles, but in fact, it applied to any real property
Mm-hmm.
that was sold for more than $5
5
million.
million.
dollars. And the tax comprised a 4% on the gross sales. So even if you lost money on the
That's a
sale of
big
the
one.
property, even if you lost money on it,
Yeah.
you still had to pay it on the gross. And um, many people who are in the real estate development business, if they could get a 12% profit on a sale of a property after
Mm-hmm.
they've done all the work, taken all the risk, and hired people to build it and gotten loans, given personal guarantees and all that,
Right.
they'll do the deal. But suddenly you had a lot of these people that in the course of doing these developments were finding that they're not going to get the profit. The profit is going to the city for
Right.
doing absolutely nothing. It's taken away from them essentially, and it's basically given to the unions, who are, politically supportive of certain, political groups in the the city and
And
the
Keith,
state and the country.
the way they frame it though, it's collecting the tax revenue to allocate it to a fund, right? LA fund, I
Yes.
think it is, to prevent
Yeah.
homelessness. But you're saying
Yeah.
it goes specifically also to unions that are able to
Well, yeah.
regulate it to some degree.
Yeah. Well, here's really the unions and some of nonprofit organizations were the ones behind the ULA.
Okay.
They were the sponsors of it, and the terms of the ULA require that the money goes to. They have special exemptions if some of these
Yeah.
nonprofits were to buy the property, and it's not just any nonprofit. It's basically catered to the nonprofits that sponsored
Hmm.
the ULA initiative, and it also requires that the buildings to house these homeless people be built with union labor, the union labor of the
Oh,
people that have done it, and
okay.
that adds about 16% on the cost
Right.
of construction above and beyond what normal construction would
Right.
be. So the whole idea that they're going to take this money and they're going to build low cost housing, which is going to cost way more than regular housing would cost.
Hmm.
But it's essentially a conduit between taking the equity from property owners, uh, and they could be people who own small apartment buildings. They could be mom and pop
Right.
stores. They could be
1031 exchanges too, right?
yeah. You
Everything.
don't get any exemption from that.
Right.
You may get you may be able to not have to pay federal taxes on a 1031, but you still have to pay this ULA tax,
What
and
we
it's
find crazy interesting in probably in a bad way is what you had said earlier was the fact that you're the property owner, you sell it right over 5 million. Essentially, whether you make money or not, you still have to pay that extreme tax of 4%
yeah, yeah.
in that
Yeah,
specific case.
you could be totally in distress. You could be selling your property because you can't afford it,
Right.
because you're about to be foreclosed upon,
Yeah.
and you still have to pay this tax. And the rationale was, well, if you own a property that's worth more than $5 million, by definition, you must be rich,
Yeah.
and you must be able to afford to pay the cost of ameliorating the homelessness.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
homelessness is a societal problem. It's a serious problem, but it's a problem that belongs to everybody in society, and it's a communal responsibility of
Hmm.
everybody in society to solve it, not simply people who own properties. What about people who own crypto? What about people
Right.
who own artwork or people
Right.
who own stocks? It's discriminatory against people who own real estate.
And that's where your challenge is. But before we go into the challenge, also, I want to hear more about how it affects other people outside of the 5 million and up. But I do want to share some information. The newest update is as of, I think, early a couple months ago, it's now sales tax of 4% from 5.15 million to 10.3 million. And anything above 10.3 million is 5.5%. So at
Right.
a $5,150,000 home, you're getting taxed about 206,000 on that alone, which there already is transfer tax fees in city of LA and LA County, and now you have this Measure ULA tax, which is crazy. And one last thing to note: 6 or 8 years ago, they had Measure H, which was there to bring up $3.5 billion in tax revenue to fight homelessness in the matter of 10 years. And then about a year or two after that, they did Measure HHH, which was there to bring up 1.2 billion in tax revenue to prevent homelessness. And Chris and I were just talking earlier how this homelessness just continues, and we're just going to throw more money into a money pit. Essentially, is what a lot of people are feeling. I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Oh,
it's
go
it's
ahead. Sorry.
going it's essentially going to the wrong places. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
these measures have not worked. What you need is more housing, not not more restrictions on
Right.
housing, and then uh, uh, taking the money from people who would normally be in the business
Mm-hmm.
and giving it to unions and nonprofits to build uh, properties that cost way more than what the merchant builders
Right.
would do. It's just a political money grab is really what it is,
Right.
and they should be incentivizing the people who were in the business of building housing to keep doing it and to do it more efficiently and to do it cheaper,
Mm-hmm.
than to basically put them out of business by taking their profit and
Right.
giving it to somebody else so that they can build things inefficiently and benefit from this political money grab.
How do you think
So
it affects people though? Like people that aren't homeowners or property owners, let's say, or property owners that aren't selling above 5.15 million. Why do you think it's a bad thing for people in the bracket beneath that don't qualify for that?
well, I think it's going to be a very bad thing for people who need housing because you're discouraging new
Right.
housing. So what happens when you discourage supply?
Mm-hmm.
You have increasing demand, but you discourage supply. Well, prices go up. So what does that mean? It means it's more unaffordable to people, which
Right.
means you have more homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not solving the homelessness problem, you're exacerbating the homelessness problem.
Mm-hmm.
And it should be clear to anybody who has any kind of familiarity with the principles of economics, but politically it just sounds so appealing to stick it to people that are perceived to be rich simply because they may own a property that has a sales value of $5 million, even if they have no equity in it.
Right. I think that's the environment we're in now, right, Chris? What do you think?
Yeah, and I just wanted to, sometimes like a simple numbers make pictures clearer. But if you look at like year over year, just the past 5 years, and we know it's been longer than that, but it's been anywhere from 6 to 13% increase in homelessness every year, year over year, for the past 5 years.
In
In that
California.
span, there's been over $20 billion poured into California to solve the homeless problem, and so there's this investment in this issue, but you're seeing the opposite result that you'd want to see. You see an increase. And so I think if you're, regardless of where you stand politically, this problem isn't getting solved the way it is said to be solved. It's getting worse. So why would a taxpayer trust the government to fix it now? I think LA Times had an article recently where they mentioned that there's basically $20 billion that is unaccounted for. And there's a
That's
report
crazy.
that came out. And I would be interested to see, is there any legislation that can be done towards the government for this misuse of funds?
Well, they certainly should have had some controls in place
Mm-hmm.
when they collected all these monies from people. And I think that the same thing is likely to happen with the ULA. But what also was interesting in terms of the complete misrepresentation of it
Yeah.
is that it anticipated that the ULA was going to raise somewhere between 700 million and 1.1 billion dollars a year,
Yeah.
and this was going to really solve the problem. What really happened was it killed the real estate industry. It just killed it. It didn't single handedly kill it. The interest
Yeah.
rates went up as well,
Yeah. That didn't help.
but it helped to put a stake through the heart of the real estate industry and
Mm-hmm.
people who had jobs and were prospering before. Some of them don't have jobs, and the ones that are still at it are not prospering as they were. So they haven't raised the kind of money that they were thinking
No.
about, but
No.
they certainly, I think they've been raising about $200 million a year, which is way short of
Mm-hmm.
their projections. But the damage that they've done in the industry has been far greater than $200 million a year. It's probably
Right.
in the billions of dollars a
The
year.
the proposal Mayor Bass did was in April of 2023. She readjusted her proposal, is what I was seeing, and the budget was from the budget of LA. It was actually 150 million, so it's actually probably even less than that, I imagine.
Yeah,
But what you said spot on too, because it did kind of kill the real estate industry above 5 million. I'll share some other stats, which I'm sure you're aware of, but I want the audience to know. But in 2022, homes in city of LA, there were about over 160 or so homes from 5 million and up. In 2023, there was only 53. In 2024, there's now 92. I think in 23, the reason why it was 53 was because of the fact that it drastically fell down because homeowners didn't want to obviously sell and get taxed. They also were hoping people like yourself and your organizations were going to be able to challenge it and beat it. And you'll talk about that in a moment, I imagine, of what happened with that challenge. But in 2024, now it's 92 units. So it's definitely hurt and impacted the industry out here for sure.
it's also hurt the county of Los Angeles
Mm-hmm.
and the funding for the county because what the county has always relied upon for property taxes is properties turning over at a higher price than what their Prop 13 bases were.
Right, right.
So properties get reassessed when they're sold. So you
Mm-hmm.
could have a building that you've owned since 1975 or something, and you bought it for $1 million, and now it's worth $30 million. And if you were to sell it, the next guy is going to have to pay a lot more in property taxes
Mm-hmm.
than you've been paying based on your 1975 assessment as adjusted by inflation. And the county has always relied upon those increased revenues to fund county programs.
Right, right.
Well, if people now have a disincentive to sell their properties because they have to pay this ULA tax, the properties are not turning over as quickly, so the county is not getting the higher assessed values from these things. So they may be running short on funding to provide county services. And really, I would think that people outside of the city of Los Angeles, but in Los Angeles County,
Mm,
would be rather perturbed that they're going to have to suffer because the city of Los Angeles has imposed this terrible tax,
right.
which is not even doing what they said it would do. But now people in the county have to suffer from reduced services because there isn't enough money anymore to pay for them because the ULA has essentially destroyed that source of income. So it's been bad in every possible way. This ULA has been a curse.
What I'm concerned about is what if it spills over to Orange County or Ventura County? Do you think that that's kind of what the goal is here with the people that started all this? Is that would there
Well,
be a ripple effect?
yeah, it certainly, as I said, it was sponsored by a union, and it's a national union,
Hmm.
and
Oh,
some of
National
so,
Union.
yeah, it's
Oh,
the like the main proponent is the SEIU, and they're very active throughout the country.
okay,
And there's other
okay.
unions as well, but they're one of the main ones. And
Hmm.
they're also very, very active in making political donations, etc. And so there are a bunch of other cities now. I know that Chicago has considered something similar to the ULA tax. I
Yep.
believe San Diego has as well.
Santa
It's
Monica.
it's it's the new it's the new kid on the block for
Hmm.
raising money for municipalities or for whatever their pet causes are. And I think that if it is not challenged and if it's not defeated in the courts, it's going to be a serious problem throughout the country.
Hmm.
Um, but it just has this political appeal. They call it a mansion tax.
Right.
It's very very misleading because um, if you discourage the small build any kind of an apartment building pretty much it costs more than $5 million. I mean
Yeah.
certainly a new one does so if you're going to discourage people from building them, you're not going to have new supply. If you're not going to have new supply, you're going to have higher rents. And if
Yeah.
you keep capping the rents, then you're just going to have less supply. And so either you have no housing or you have housing that people can't afford. And those are not good solutions to if you want to get rid of homelessness.
Hmm.
So it was very very ill conceived, and but they got away with it, and they managed to convince 57% of the
Right.
public to vote for it,
Right.
and without much foresight as to the consequences of doing so, and now we're suffering for it.
I read a USC article. They actually named you in your challenge. They included the challenge that you did, and I want you to explain that in a moment. But going off of what you said of the example of, property prices will continue to rise and rental prices, I think you might have mentioned, could also rise because of this. There's a real estate executive, and I'll read it out. His name is Moses Kagan. I think that's how you spell it. He outlined that he outlined as a developer when he invests in a $7 million project in Los Angeles, city of LA, to construct an apartment, and he aims to sell it, for example, at 10 million. He's making a profit about 2.3 million when he includes depreciation and all these other factoring expenses. But the bill at 5.5% rate amounts to about $550,000 on of tax of that, and that's about a 24% tax on the profit alone. And typically, investors receive about 80% profit while developers get about 20% of that profit. So that's going to kill the business. And he was saying the investor's either going to absorb that cost or he's going to throw it onto the buyer of the condo, whatever it might be, or the renter of that apartment, and they're going to have to deal with the higher prices. So I think you do have a point there.
Well, I think more likely is they just won't build in the city of Los
Yeah,
Angeles.
that's
That's
less units.
it. Just the city of Los Angeles has become a pariah
Hmm.
for new housing or new rental housing, and same with the banks. Why do the banks want to deal with it?
Right.
There's an increased risk to the banks as well
Hmm.
because whereas before, if the banks made a loan and they had to take the building back, they would take the building back, they would sell it. But now, if the banks take the building
Yeah,
back
it's
and they have to
true.
sell
I
it,
didn't think
and
of
if
that.
it's a $10 million building, they got to pay 5.5% just to get rid of the collateral. How? What? Number one, are they going to charge more for their loans? And number
Hmm.
two, are they even going to make the loans?
Right.
So it just makes it even more of a constraint on supply, which means ultimately less supply, higher prices, higher rents. So there's nothing good about this law,
Right.
nothing good about this initiative. It's all bad. Everything about it is bad.
Yeah.
And it's not capable of producing the results that they claimed it would. It's not reducing homelessness because you don't have enough money to do it. And even the deployment of those monies to gold plated union contracts
Hmm.
to build things that are not economically feasible doesn't help.
Right.
As the product costs more and more, the number of units you can build with the smaller amounts of money that you're collecting is fewer and fewer. So you've trashed a whole industry that could have provided things in place of something that's completely inefficient and relatively small in terms of magnitude.
Hmm. Yeah, especially if they're not tracking where those expenses are going when they're here to
Well, that it
supposedly.
makes it even worse, of course.
Yeah. So where are you at with the challenge? I know you challenged it in 2023 with what's the name of it? The I think you joined with Howard Jarvis Tax Association and the Apartment
Well,
Association.
we didn't exactly join with them. We were the courts consolidated the actions,
Okay.
so we have worked independently of Howard Jarvis. Howard Jarvis had their one
Hmm.
cause of action under state law. Essentially, they were saying that the law conflicted with the city of Los Angeles charter. That based on the charter, it was they couldn't do it. Um, it's an argument that's been made in other courts and has been rejected. It's a state law argument. So what that means is they could not appeal it to ultimately to the U.S. Supreme Court. So it lives and dies in the state courts, and it's only a one
Okay.
trick pony basically. Ours, we threw everything under the sun into our lawsuits: equal protection, violation of freedom of speech. Um, we had even the dormant commerce clause. I mean, there were all kinds of things. Anything that we could think of, we threw into our lawsuits, and mostly federal constitutional arguments
Hmm.
with the hope that we would get to stay in the federal court and ultimately, if necessary, find our way to the U.S. Supreme Court to finally decide it.
Hmm.
It was most likely that because the amounts at stake were so high, whoever lost would appeal it to the next stage until finally you run out of places to appeal it to when
Right.
you get to the U.S. Supreme Court, and either the U.S. Supreme Court would take the case or they wouldn't take the case, in which
Hmm.
case that would be the end of it.
Hmm.
So where we are now is we in the state court, the proponents of the ULA filed a motion for judgment on the pleadings, which basically is a motion that says even if you assume everything in the lawsuit is true and correct, it still doesn't state a cause of action under the law. And the
Hmm.
judge that Judge Shepper, who was presiding over the case, granted the motion for judgment on the pleadings. So that meant that we now filed an appeal to the Court of Appeal. and so did the Jarvis people. So that one is pending. It's relatively early stage of the appeal. We're still gathering the documents, and nobody's filed an opening brief yet.
Mm,
In the federal case, it was a little different in the sense that the proponents of the ULA filed a motion to dismiss on the grounds that the federal court did not have jurisdiction to hear this case, citing the Tax Injunction Act, which in general terms says that if you have a state tax,
mm,
then the federal courts will not interfere with the state tax. There is a three-pronged test to determine whether an assessment is in fact a tax for the purposes of the Tax Injunction Act. And we argued that it isn't a tax. And basically, it's called the Bedart test. And the prongs of the Bedart test are: number one, who passed the tax? And the
mm,
Bedart case says if it's the state legislature that passes the tax or passes the assessment, it's more likely to be a tax than if it's like a state apple commission,
mm,
a regulatory commission. Okay, fair enough. That's what that says. The second prong of the test is, well, how many people does it affect? Is it an assessment of general application like the
mm,
income tax is, where everybody
right.
has to pay it? It affects everybody, or is it just on a small group of people? Well, clearly in this particular
Small.
case, it was on a small group of people because there were very few transactions that would even qualify.
And
Uh,
just to clarify that, does that fall under the U.S. Constitution equal protection clause? Is that what you're insinuating right there,
Um,
or is it more
well,
state level?
the equal protection clause is part of what we've argued in this, it's not specific to the Bedart three prong test.
Mm,
What we argued in relation to the first prong is, well, okay, if it was the general legislature that passed it, then it might be more likely to be a tax. But this wasn't the general legislature that passed this. This was an initiative by a bunch of voters. And
mm,
the the rationale of the Bedart test is essentially a statistical probability. They say, okay, of all these different assessments that have been passed, which ones are more likely to be taxes? Were they passed by the legislature? They're more likely to be taxes. Passed by some regulatory board, less likely to be taxes. But out of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases that the courts have looked at, there were only two cases that cited the Bedart test that related to a voter's initiative.
mm,
And one of them said it was a tax, and one of them said it wasn't a tax. So we argued that the something that was passed by voters' initiative is not more likely to be a tax than not to be a tax, because there's no historical record of assessments by voters' initiatives that have been found to be taxes. It's not like something being passed by a legislature or even something being passed by a city council.
mm,
So we said that prong should have gone to us. The second prong, the judge agreed it does go to us, that it's clearly not a tax of general application.
right.
And so therefore we win on that prong. So we should have won on two of the three prongs, in which case it is not a tax uh, for the purposes of jurisdiction, and the federal court should have kept the jurisdiction. The third prong is, does it go into a general fund, in which case it's more likely to be a tax, or does it go into a special fund, in which case it's less likely to be a tax? Well, this one, as you mentioned at the beginning of your broadcast, clearly goes into a special fund,
Right.
which means it's much less likely to be a tax.
Mm,
So we should have won on that one too. There is a caveat that says, however, but even if it goes into a special fund, if it is considered to be for the general benefit, if the monies are ultimately expended for the general benefit of the public, then it can still be a tax.
It's really
Well,
mm,
subjective.
Well, what we argued on this was that clearly it hasn't really been for the general benefit of the public because it's destroyed the industry
Yeah.
and it hasn't helped very many people. And that our argument was you have to look at not only the prospective benefit of something, but the detriments and the side effects as well. You could say, well, a pill that somebody made that helps to reduce acid indigestion is a benefit until you find out that it kills 100% of the people that ingest it, or even 5% of the people
Right.
that ingest it, in which case you can't really say it's a general benefit to the public. And
Mm.
so that was an argument that we've made, that it really wasn't a general benefit to the public. But in any event, at the pleading stage, where what we say in our complaint is deemed for the purposes of a motion to dismiss to be true, and we said it isn't a general benefit, we should have won on that. So those are our arguments before, some of our arguments before the Court of Appeal. The judge at the trial level made the determination that it was a tax, and he found that at least two of the three Bedard factors um, said it was a tax, and he said that if it was passed by an initiative, then it's
Mm.
more likely to be a tax. And we said, don't see that at all. There's no historical precedent for that. There's no empirical evidence that would be the case.
This is the federal judge, right?
Yeah, the federal judge at the district court. And then he said, because this was for homelessness, it was a general benefit. He said, because it
Oh,
said it was for homelessness, a general benefit. And we said, well, supposing it says in its preamble it's for world peace, does that mean it is for world
right.
peace? I
That's a
mean,
good point.
just because they say it in a preamble doesn't necessarily mean, if that's all you had to do to never appear before a federal court, nobody would ever appear before a federal court. If all you have to do is just have a one self-serving statement in the initiative that says this is for the general benefit of the public, world peace, racial harmony, any good, happy words, then the federal court would be completely excluded from completely unconstitutional taxes,
Mhm.
just simply by having some self-serving words in it. So that is another argument that we made in our briefs, that just what it says in the preamble doesn't necessarily mean anything. You can take it into account, but you have to look at the actual results.
Right.
Is it really a general benefit? And we say it's not a general benefit if you destroy a whole industry and you don't help very many people, if any.
Mm.
It's not a general benefit, it's a detriment. So
Is
therefore, at least two of the three factors should have been that it's not a tax
yeah.
for the purposes of that Tax Injunction Act, and that the district court should have exercised jurisdiction over our complaint.
I don't
And
see any
that's,
improvement in the homelessness situation since it happened. So,
Well, do you
especially
yeah.
when you
do you
hear
feel
pop
like you'll
measure
get
H.
a more fair shake in the appellate court? Do you feel like you get a more legalistic shake when it's not someone that's appointed by, a politician? It's more of a collective of folks that obviously are passionate about law, and then obviously the same could go for, California, a judge there. The appellate court, it's more of a collective of legal minds. Do you feel like you'll get a more legal fair shake?
Honestly, no. I think that the problem is, even when they're appointed politically. So the ones that are appointed by liberal presidents
Hmm.
will be appointed because they have liberal philosophies.
I see.
Philosophies. The ones that are appointed by conservative presidents
Hmm.
will have conservative philosophies. So it really depends upon who has appointed you. I don't think that the judges are intrinsically objective. They were appointed for certain reasons, and this is why they have the big battles over the candidates for the U.S. Supreme Court,
Hmm.
because it does matter. You
Right.
can see when and the big important decisions. You can just look at, for example, the big one, Bush versus Gore, when you had a razor thin
Hmm.
election, and it went down to an adjudication by the U.S. Supreme Court, and ultimately the majority of the court by one was Republican. So Bush won, and they just went right along party lines. There were
Right.
five
Hmm.
Republicans, four Democrats. Bush ended up the president. So it is important
Mm-hmm.
where they come from. I don't think that any of these judges are apolitical. I'd love to think that they
That'd be
were.
great if they were. Yeah.
I'd love to think that they were, and I'd love to think that they just follow the law, whatever the law says. But it has not been my
Right.
experience, and it's very frustrating as a lawyer. Sometimes you wonder why you even go to law school, because the results ultimately are political results rather than legal results,
Right.
and certainly that's I think we've been finding that.
Mm-hmm.
But one, hope springs eternal. That
Where are you at with the lawsuit now, though?
right now in the federal lawsuit, it's been fully briefed, and we were to have oral argument on November 6th.
Oh, okay.
And then, but we received notice from the court, the Ninth Circuit, that they don't feel the need to have oral argument in this case, and they're going to decide the case without any oral argument. Um,
Really? Wow.
that's very disappointing to
Right.
me. And, I certainly, the benefit of having oral argument is that it's streamed on the internet, which is basically all over the world, and
Yeah.
there's a record of it, and people can hear it, and people can see justice being made. They can see the sausage being made. If they take oral argument out of it, you run the risk of just having some very obscure judgment that doesn't say very much,
Mm-hmm.
that could possibly be politically motivated. They could even have an unpublished memorandum decision that just kind of buries the whole issue and takes away any kind of public scrutiny of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would have much preferred to have the oral argument. It's not to say that we've lost because we don't have the oral argument, but I would. They only give oral argument to 18% of the cases. So if you're going to win a
Mm-hmm.
case, usually the request to have oral argument is a hopeful sign, because you're in the 18% that they decided were worthy of the oral argument. And I think what happens is the clerks look at the briefs, and they make the initial decision as to, well, yeah, this is something that should be argued orally.
Wow, that's not really great. That's the case.
Well, I think they're probably the ones that read everything the most carefully, and they're the ones that are the least political.
Oh,
I
okay.
think
So it
I think
types
the
it better.
clerks are the ones that are probably the most objective.
Oh.
But then ultimately, a couple weeks or so uh, before the case is heard, the panel is chosen. It may be earlier than a couple of weeks, but I'm not aware of when they're done. But the three judge panel is decided, and then they look at the documentation, and they decide whether they need to hear oral argument
Okay.
or not.
So okay, they
So,
decide.
so the clerks look at it objectively, and they
Got
say,
it.
yeah, this is a case that should hear oral argument, but the final decision is up to the actual judges, who are going to be hearing and deciding the case, or simply deciding the case.
It
So
seems
that's
like
kind of in the
for
works then.
it
Go
seems
ahead.
like for ballot measures, um, the text that gets written on there is in the point of view of the person who's presented this ballot measure, the pro side.
Of
Is
course.
there a way to counteract a measure like this in the next election, and you get to present the argument on the ballot?
Well, they do allow
Counters on it.
opinions to be expressed. You have a pro and a con
Mm-hmm.
opinion expressed, but the actual wording of the initiative itself is done by the sponsors of it. So,
That's how
what
you
I
win the
find,
title.
yeah, in the title, and what I find really disturbing is they'll put in the initiative, uh, it is, we find this, the following findings have been made. This will create world peace. This will create racial harmony. This will be a public benefit. This will be all these things. And there's nothing whatsoever to back it up, except the fact that the proponents of the initiative put it in there.
Mm.
And then often you'll get the courts, some of the courts will look at it and say, well, it was found that this is for public benefit. We have to go with that. It was found that it's going to reduce homelessness. Well, that's good. We'll have to find that. But they could put in an initiative that we find that the sun will not rise again in the city of Los Angeles, and that's a public benefit. And I go,
Mm-hmm.
well, okay, they put it in there. The law of gravity will no longer apply in the city of Los Angeles. It's what's different about an initiative as opposed to legislation passed by uh, a legislative body is that the proponents can put anything they like in it.
Right, right.
Nobody made the finding. There was no necessary factual or empirical basis for any of the statements that they made in it. They're strictly political points of view. But if the people voted for it, then it's deemed to be cast in stone. It's the law, and other people give deference to it, which where it deserves no deference whatsoever. Like, for example, if you're in the legislature, somebody proposes a bill, you'll have debate back and forth. There'll be proponents, opponents. There'll be people that that have sworn an oath of allegiance to the U.S. And the state constitutions to uphold and defend the Constitution. That can be sanctioned or fined or even removed from office if they violate that. Then it goes through the one body, the assembly, and then it goes through the Senate, and then they have debate on it. They'll have expert witnesses. They'll have studies. They'll have empirical evidence. All of these things that vet the precepts of this particular legislation, and then finally, after it goes through the two bodies of government, it has to be signed by the governor. So
I
this is
see.
carefully vetted. On the
Yeah,
other hand, an initiative can say whatever the hell it
that's
wants,
scary.
and ads go on the media that this is going to do this is going to do that. The people that are voting have heard 30 seconds worth of stuff on whatever it is, and they say, okay, yeah, this is mansion tax, millionaires and billionaires who don't pay their fair share. Yeah, stick it to them. You won't have to pay anything. And that's exactly what it said in the
Right,
materials. It
right.
said millionaires and billionaires who don't pay their fair share will have to pay this, and you won't have to pay a penny.
Yeah, I think a
Well,
lot of people didn't pay attention. They didn't read into it. They saw the headline, went with
right,
that, felt good
yeah.
about it, and that's why I tell a lot of people as an agent when I'm helping my clients, I tell them it's very important what city you buy in and to stay involved in policy because you just never know. Like you laid out with the initiatives, they could throw pretty much anything in there, and if it passes, right?
Well, yeah, and what's even worse, and I think that there was a shafting on this. The Business Roundtable and a bunch of other people tried to propose their own initiative. It was called the Taxpayers Protection Act, and it was supposed to go on this ballot, on the ballot of this election that we're having right
That's
now.
a good title.
And, and a lot of the same proponents of the ULA opposed it in court. You know,
Oh,
once
yeah,
again, the same unions, and they opposed it in court, and they got Governor Newsom to oppose it in court, and so it went before the California Supreme Court, and the California Supreme Court ruled it was unconstitutional, and they wouldn't even let it go on the ballot.
that's a bit unfair then.
Well, it's totally political as far as
Yeah.
I can see. I mean, they just cut them off at the knees. And this Taxpayers Protection Act would have had the effect of repealing the ULA,
Hmm.
essentially.
I think
It would
that's
have had
where the
other.
sorry, I was just gonna say I think that's where the culture of California is at, especially Los
Yeah.
Angeles. Do you see majority of like the average person that doesn't really stay super involved in politics that you might have come across since you're heavily involved in all this? Do you believe most of them are for this measure that passed or?
I don't think, well, I think most of them don't care.
Mm,
I think, I think really it's a very hard sell
mm-hmm.
to convince people that if you keep punishing the people who build housing and
Yeah.
the landlords who own housing,
Mm-hmm.
if you keep punishing them, that you will reduce supply. And when you reduce supply and demand increases, rents go up and prices go up. It's
Right.
just such a hard sell. They
Yeah, it
they
is.
just they are much more persuaded by the characterization of these people as greedy developers and greedy
Right.
landlords, and we must punish those people, and we must stop rents being increased, and we must tax them, to death if they try to build other buildings and all that because they're rich and greedy people. Because
Yeah.
they see at point of sale that they look at, well, there's one landlord, there might be 300 tenants in a building, so the tenants are poor and the tenants are good, and then the landlord is one person, so he's rich and he's bad.
Right.
And that's a characterization. And from a political point of view, you have 400 tenants in there that are voters, and you have one landlord
Right.
that's a voter. And so it's a slam bang winner to villainize the minority and to cater and pander to the majority, even though the ultimate effect of it is that the majority is going to be hurt because they're not going to have the product and they're not going to be able to afford it if anyone even chooses to build it.
Right. And
So,
that's where the education system probably is where it turns people's mindset in that mindset essentially. Because when
yeah.
I was in college, I didn't hear any of this in high school. I didn't hear any of this about supply and demand really in college until I took an economics course. And even then, it took those steps to get there. And not everybody takes economics, right?
Yeah, it's just it's such a facile argument to be able to make.
Mm-hmm.
Just the same way as the gasoline station owner is the villain when gas prices go up, or the owner of the grocery store is the villain when groceries go up, and
Yeah.
they completely ignore the fact that you have your whole chain of supply, and you have a whole bunch of taxes that are imposed on these things at different levels.
And you have
And
competitors.
yeah, and you have competitive. You have all kinds of inflationary factors because perhaps the government pumped a lot of money into to the system, and now you have more money chasing fewer goods, etc. So, but it's politically, it's so seductive to be able to point to the one person, your bad greedy landlord,
Right.
your bad greedy grocer owner, or your bad greedy gas station owner. It's a whole chain, but it's easier from a political point of view to villainize
Right.
these more conspicuous people than all the other people down the line, or to recognize what causes the inflationary forces or what causes prices to go up. It's not always just price gouging, It's
Mm-hmm.
just it's supply and demand, and
Yeah, and a lot of
you
people that are providing these actual the physical capital or intellectual capital into the market that is having things actually move and happen
yeah.
for people, those profit margins continue thinning out and thinning out. Eventually, like you were saying, they're just going to move out of the city of
Yeah.
LA.
Well, that's what
That's
it
what's
is.
happening.
There's plenty of developers, plenty of builders, plenty of people that used to do fix and flips, for example.
Yeah.
So no way in Los Angeles are they going to do
Hmm.
it because they've imposed too many burdens on them, and no way do they want to build apartment buildings here
But fix and
because
flips, as long as you stay below 5 million, you're good. But eventually, this is what I talk to some clients. Like you could buy a $2 million house or $1 million. Now that everything's
right.
pretty much a million, over time you're going to end up getting into the 5 million bracket or 5.15.
Of course you will, and the counter argument that the proponents made to that was, well, it's indexed with inflation. So as you mentioned, the initial
Mm-hmm.
$5 million became 5 million
5.15.
and something or other.
Mm-hmm.
And but the fact is, if you look at the statistics, I was just looking at today in California over the last 40 years, inflation went up by about 200 and something percent, and I think the wages went up about 200 and something percent, but the price of real estate went up 600 and something percent.
Wow. Yeah.
So you could see over time, real estate
Goes up.
goes much higher.
Yeah.
So basically, this inflationary uh, adjustment that they had is really kind of irrelevant because the cost of real estate will keep rising a lot more than the little tiny adjustment that they've allowed. And eventually, everybody will be stuck with this thing. If you look at houses, for example, that are 5 million now, 40 years ago, they were 1/6 of that price, so they weren't even $1 million.
Right. But some people would be like, well, by the time it hits 5 million, like 60 years ago when it was way less, now it's 5 million. It doesn't matter to me. But what's important in life is you generally, if you have children or whatever, someone in your lineage of some sort, you want to give that property to them, right? That's kind of the concept here.
Well, yeah, that's one thing, and the other thing is, who says that these things are only going to be limited to 4% or 5.5%? If they get away with it at 5.5%, why not take 20%? Why
Yeah.
not take 30%?
Do you think
Why not
Proposition
take it
13 will
all?
go away? Proposition
Huh?
13. Do you think
They've been
Proposition 13?
they keep chipping away
I
at it.
know. Yeah, I
It's
see
just
that.
I mean, this is what's most frustrating, and if you look at it from the standpoint of a lawyer reading these decisions, it's infuriating because it's intentional obtuseness by a lot of the courts. For example, Prop 13 is very, very clear as to what it's supposed to be,
Hmm.
but then the courts chip away at it and they say, "Well, it didn't mean this, didn't
Can you
mean that."
explain it
So,
for the people that don't
well,
know?
Prop 13 in the late 70s, what was happening is that properties were assessed for property tax purposes based on their actual values, and the values would go up from time to time, and they were going up rather rapidly in the
Hmm.
70s. So what was happening was that people would get tax bills that could possibly be triple what they were the year before, and they'd have to pay so much more in taxes on an asset that they owned,
Right.
but they didn't have any corresponding increase in their income to pay these taxes. So it was threatening the ability of a lot of property owners to even be able to maintain their properties, to keep them, and
Hmm.
could force them to sell their homes simply because they couldn't pay the property taxes. So there
Valid.
was a movement headed by Howard Jarvis at the time when he was alive to and he proposed this Prop 13, which said that the property taxes would be based upon the value as they existed at the time that somebody purchased their property,
Hmm.
uh, with a small adjustment per year. And I think it was 1.25%, plus any kind of special indebtedness that the municipalities had to impose for improvements, etc. So what that meant was, as time went on, the properties increased in value, but the property taxes didn't increase that much.
Hmm.
So, for example, and this is getting back to the point I made earlier as to the collection of taxes for the counties. Um, you could have bought a property, say, 20 years ago for $1 million, and your property tax on that would be $12,500 a year.
Hmm.
And as time went on, that property might become worth 2 million, might become worth 3 million, but your property taxes would still be around 12,000 adjusted by a little bit. So they might be $15,000 now. But the next guy,
Thanks to Prop 13. Yeah.
yeah, to Prop 13. But then if they were to sell that property and they sold it to somebody for $3 million, the next guy would have to pay the 1.25% tax on what he paid, which was 3 million. So now the other guy was paying around $15,000 a year in tax. The new guy is paying over thirty
Right.
thousand dollars a year for the exact same property, just maybe a
And
day later.
that's why it's good for
So
sales to keep going. And when you're
well, the
hurting the
sales would keep
market
going,
above, yeah.
and the county tax assessor or the county tax collector was getting the increase, and so they would rely on that. They would
Hmm.
say, "Well, we know there's going to be a certain number of properties that turn over, so we're going to keep getting increased revenues. So, given that we keep getting increased revenues, we can budget revenues for." Libraries, we can budget revenues for the court system, we can budget revenues for parks and recreation and all the things that the county government pays for. And but then when something like ULA came in and froze the market, they could no longer rely upon the turnover and the increases in property taxes
Hmm.
on a lot of those properties that would have sold for over 5 million. And sometimes it can be a very big difference. You could have an office building
Hmm.
that somebody bought for $10 million in 1980 that would be worth $150 million now, and they can't get their hands on the increased tax revenue from it because the owners of the building now are saying there's no way I'm going to pay that ULA tax, so
Right.
we're going to find a way to hang on to the building. And so it's been bad for collection of taxes for the counties as well. But what going back to the question about what's going to happen to Prop 13, well, you can see the courts have been whittling away at it,
Right.
and the Prop 13 has a whole bunch of prohibitions on uh, city governments and state governments raising property taxes. So then the courts would say, well, that was the city governments and the state governments acting as legislatures, but it doesn't apply to initiatives, voter initiatives. And so, well, why not? Well, because they just decided it didn't. So now they have all these voter initiatives that have become exempted from Prop 13. And that's basically how the ULA came about. There
I
was
see.
a case called, I think it was Upland versus cannabis. It was cannabis case versus Upland. And it went to the California Supreme Court. And they basically said that the provisions of Prop 13 don't apply to um, uh, taxes passed by an initiative as opposed to
Hmm.
taxes passed by the legislature or a legislative body. So that emboldened the proponents to start passing these kinds of taxes that would
I
not be
see.
permitted. They
Hmm.
would not be permitted by a city government to do. Like if the city council had passed the ULA, it would have been struck down by the provisions of Prop 13, which is
I
essentially
understand. That makes a lot of sense, actually.
yeah, which is essentially what Howard Jarvis's argument is.
Mm,
They're saying that the city charter for the city of Los Angeles says that nothing can be passed by initiative that could not be passed by the city council itself. And so therefore they're saying it's that this is invalid because the city council couldn't pass it. So therefore the initiative couldn't pass it. But the courts have been saying yeah, but if it's passed by a city initiative, then it
I see.
supersedes the charter, and the charter, if it had intended to specifically apply to initiatives, they should have said so more specifically. It's too vague. We have to find in favor of the validity of the initiative, and it's just judicial activism to try to undermine Prop 13, and that's really what's been going
Do
on.
you still
They
have confidence, though, that this is going to be challenged and Measure ULA will be thrown out, or no?
I think if we could get to the U.S. Supreme Court,
Hmm.
I think it would be a slam dunk.
Okay.
I think the U.S. Supreme Court would look at it and say this is totally unconstitutional, and they are a more conservative and a more property rights protective judicial body than certainly any of the courts in California are,
Hmm.
including the California Supreme Court.
Okay.
So if we could stay in federal court, I think we have a greater chance
Hmm.
also in federal court because it is less prone to local politics than the state court system is. But the politics pervade all of the courts.
Yeah,
Just really depends on who you get as the judges.
that's the
The
risk.
Ninth Circuit traditionally has been extremely liberal. It's been one of the most overturned appellate courts in the country, but the U.S. Supreme Court can't take every case, and not every case can get there, and not every case can have the financing to get there.
Right.
I'm certainly very hopeful that we would win in the federal court, but I finally found out who the panel was in the federal court, and some of
Oh,
them are very well known for their liberal leanings. So
okay.
it makes it, in my opinion, less likely that
Yeah.
we'll get somewhere. But I'm hopeful that we still have some judges, irrespective of whatever their political leanings
Hmm.
are, that will look at the law dispassionately and objectively and just say, call balls and strikes
Right.
rather
Baseball
than
term. Way
try
to
to,
go.
yeah, you rather, yeah, appropriate now,
Yeah.
considering the Dodgers just won the World Series,
Right.
but
Right.
that they won't have any political leaning in terms of the decision that they make, and that's my hope. I don't know these. I've never appeared before any of these panel members, so I don't have any firsthand knowledge of how they operate, and I'm hopeful that they will see the merits of our arguments and that they'll vote in our favor because I think we're right,
Yeah.
and according to law,
So
and that's what
you'll
it should
keep
be.
us updated on what's next, right? I would imagine, and
Be happy to do that
please
if we can
do.
keep in touch.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suspect. I don't know if they're going to render a decision on November 6th or if they're just going to consider the matter to
Mm-hmm.
be submitted as of November 6th, in which case I think it's their custom to render a decision within 90 days. So
Mm-hmm. Okay.
presumably we might hear something in January or so as to whether we get to stay in federal court. That's really all it is. But we want to stay in federal court, and we want to make our U.S. constitutional arguments in federal court. And I think
Okay.
if we do, I think we've got some winning arguments. I think there's many things wrong constitutionally with the ULA, and I think if we can get objective, impartial judges in the federal court system to hear those arguments, we should win.
Right. No, that's good. And I think in closing, I think it's important for those that are watching and listening that aren't property owners and don't care to be ever for whatever reason. So, someone that plans to be a renter forever, what is your message to them in regards to all of this?
It's still extremely important to them. They should be encouraging the production of housing,
Mm,
rental housing. And if you discourage the owners and builders of rental housing by propositions like ULA from building more housing, their rents are going to go up, or they won't have any rental accommodation available to them.
right.
So even if they're not an owner of a property and maybe never will be an owner of a property that's worth $5 million or more, it's still in their best interests to not have these kinds of legislation,
Mm,
because they should want to encourage the most efficient and the least expensive construction of rental housing for themselves so that their rents can be the least, and so they can have a good selection of new product.
mm,
Ultimately, what's going to happen is if you've discouraged all the new product, you'll end up with slums. You know,
mm,
if you discourage all the new product and you discourage by rent controls and other controls on the landlords from being able to improve the product and get some return for it, then ultimately the product just degrades, deteriorates, and that's how you have slums.
wow.
And
Solid.
so it's not to anyone's benefit.
Right.
This ULA is to the detriment of everybody, including the renters.
Well, Keith, we appreciate your time. Where can people find your website and get updated with the various
Yes,
things you're up to?
we have our website is
Fight you.
fightula.com, all one word. It's easy to remember, fightula.com. And we do welcome donations. This is not being funded by basically anybody except
Mm,
public donations. So
Wow.
um, we're hoping to encourage people so that we can carry on the fight.
right.
And because ultimately, if the community doesn't stand behind us, then we're stuck.
Well, you're putting up a good fight and you're facing that pressure. Full count is a baseball term where it's pressure situation, and you're definitely in that full count moment, Keith. And we
We
thank you
feel
for your
it.
time.
I have the gray hairs to prove it, or
Yes.
maybe I don't even have gray hairs anymore. I have the white hairs to prove it. So there you go. It's been a pleasure, gentlemen.
Thank
Hey,
you.
likewise. Thanks so much. We would love to have you on. That was so educational. I learned so much from this conversation, and
Hmm.
also you were right about the Yankees just fell off the face of the earth. The Dodgers didn't even need their best pitcher,
Yeah.
Tyler Glasnow, and they
Yep.
still just almost swept them. It was close to a sweep.
It definitely was.
Obviously, Yankees had a
It
good
was
game, but
exciting. It was a very exciting series. I enjoyed
mhm.
it.